those 35 words to dismantle everything that he would have done had he still been alive. So the question is, how do we not allow Dr. King's legacy to be frozen in time and instead realize the full promise of his dream and possibility and potential? Now, our presence here today, even the few of us who are left, seeks to honor not just the prophetic dreamer, but we have to remember that we have to honor all of those who were involved in the struggle. Indeed, all those who heard that clarion call that stylized the words of a prophetic order that somehow were moved to create change that helped to transform a nation into a more perfect union. See, it wasn't just Dr. King or legislative or even presidential intervention that ushered in the civil rights successes of the day. Make no mistake about that. Rather, I would argue, as Dr. King did before me, that the most significant variable that contributed to breaking down the walls of segregation and policies of Jim Crow was the human attribute of human determination on the part of people. The question is, do we have that same determination? Dr. King was clear that there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And I would argue that there are few things that are stronger than the human mind, the human heart, and the human spirit when it is focused and committed to achieving a goal. So what is the legacy that we have inherited? We got a Civil Rights Act of 1964 a year later. We got a Voting Rights Act 2 years later in 1965. We had victories in transportation and public accommodations, desegregation. All of those were ushered in. And so indeed the times have changed, and this generation now, particularly these young people, including a lot of my students and fellow anteaters here from the University of California and others, enjoy and bask in the freedom and liberty that they do, because this was made possible by those who struggled long and hard and gave their blood, sweat, and tears, and even their lives. So we honor not just Dr. King today, but all those people whose names we may not know, but whose sacrifice we should never forget. Let us not drink from the cup of abnegation and act as if there has been no progress made in the last 50 years. So first of all, let's give it up for progress in the last 50 years. But like many of you, and my students will tell you, that Dr. P has a restless spirit. And a sip of freedom and justice has never been sufficient to quench the thirst of those who feel dehydrated by the social stagnation and reductionistic policies of our nation's recent past. So just as Dr. King was clear that the recalcitrant forces of interposition and nullification could not stop the winds of change from blowing, so too must we be cognizant of the fact, as Frederick Douglass did before us, that power will concede nothing unless we demand it. Freedom and justice are not simply a plateau, but rather a process. Let me say that again. Freedom and justice are not simply a plateau, but rather are a process. And perfectibility is never an outcome, but is really about striving towards being better than we are. And while we take pride in the accomplishments of civil rights and different movements, we can't be satisfied as long as desegregating buses and lunch counters and schools and now the White House is a standard by which we judge our progress, and true integration is an illusion that we celebrate as part of a dream. We can't be satisfied with that. Hall of Fame basketball player Bill Russell, I heard him recently remind us that progress is not only measured by how far you've come, but progress ought to be measured by how far one still needs to go. And so if we are honest with ourselves, the justifiable pride and intoxicating aromas of victory we smell in the accomplishments of past and current generations of civil rights soldiers must give way to the recognition that we still got some difficult days ahead. When the Supreme Court justifies the elimination of key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, we've got some difficult days ahead. When Florida courts free killers of unarmed teens with hoodies and cell phones and Skittles, but yet incarcerate women who fire a weapon in their own house to ward off an assailant masquerading as an abusive husband. We've got some difficult days ahead. When jurors being interviewed in the Trayvon Martin case have more empathy and compassion for the killer than they do for the victim, we've got some difficult days ahead. When political party polarization in federal and state and local governments prevents any meaningful progress from being made that benefit the common man and woman, we've got some difficult days ahead. Right here in Orange County, when hunger and homelessness characterize the lifestyles of too many in the wealthiest nation on the planet, we've got some difficult days ahead. When texting and instant messaging can bring us real-time communications, but rarely, if ever, does that text and communication lead to more immediate understanding of the human condition and respect for each other's diversity, you know we've got some difficult days ahead. We have physical enhancements for beauty. I was looking at a magazine this morning, and all the advertisements were about cosmetics. Physical enhancements for beauty we obsess about, regarding our hair and our nails and breast augmentations and weight loss strategies and even plastic surgery for both men and women, provide us with cosmetic makeovers. But all the cosmetic makeover in the world can't hide the ugliness of our racial biases toward people of color. You know we've got some difficult days ahead. But we who are committed to this cause of civil rights and human dignity must not allow the movement that is built on truth and righteousness to be forgotten. Remember that a movement that is built on truth and righteousness is bigger than any institutional policy or practice. And those of us that are committed to this struggle should not be in need of institutional permission slips in order to carry out the work that we do. This is a noble struggle. We need only to remember the words that Dr. King also spoke, and Benjamin Mays did before him, when he reminded us that the measure of a man or woman is never where they stand in times of comfort and convenience, my friends. It's never where they stand in times of comfort and convenience. But it is rather they stand in times of challenge and controversy. So where will Orange County stand on the question of gun violence and availability of assault weapons that unfortunately are still finding their way to communities and schools in our own neighborhoods and all across this nation with increasing frequency? I think Dr. King would have something to say about that. Where will we stand in Orange County on the issue of affordable health care, ensuring that our citizens have access to medical care necessary so that they can concentrate on their life pursuits free from the worry of how to pay for medical intervention that is sometimes necessary? Where will we stand on the issue of access to higher education, even as the Supreme Court considers how issues of diversity and equity and inclusion should be operationalized in college and university admissions? We are still fighting about that issue. Where will we stand on issues of state appropriations at a time when states all across this nation, and even right here in California, watch higher education budgets get cut while funding for prisons and jails are augmented? And last time I heard, the Uniform Crime Statistics suggest that crime is on a decline, not an increase. And most of those we have incarcerated, 2/3 of them, are there for nonviolent drug offenses. Where are our priorities, and do we need permission slips to call attention to that problem? Indeed, Dr. King was clear that a nation that spends more money on military hardware and weapons of mass destruction than it does on education and programs dedicated to feeding children and housing the homeless is a nation that is not only approaching spiritual death, but has its priorities misaligned. So where will we stand, Orange County? It's time to stand up. It's time to speak out. It's time to continue to change those legislative and institutional policies and practices that deny too many of us the authenticity of Dr. King's dream. It's time to change our hearts. It's time to open our minds. It's time to embrace each other as members of the human family and eliminate the stains of cultural ignorance and racial insensitivity that continue to threaten the full measure of Dr. King's vision of dream and possibility. Thank you very much. Bobby McDonald, I turn it back over to you, my brother.